The letter said he needed a wife. It didn't say there were three of them. It didn't say the man who sent for her wasn't the man in charge. And it sure as hell didn't say that the most powerful rancher in Montana Territory would find her at the creek one morning in a moment she never meant anyone to see. What happened next changed both their lives forever, and neither one of them saw it coming. This is the story of Clara Whitfield and the Calloway brothers. She stepped off the stagecoach into nothing. No husband waiting, no house in sight. Just three bearded men standing in front of a limestone ranch house the size of a church and 100 miles of wilderness stretching in every direction. The letter had promised a home. The letter had promised a future. The letter, it turned out, had lied about almost everything. Clara Whitfield stood in the dust with her worn leather valise clutched so tight her knuckles had gone white. She was 5'3", thin from weeks of travel. Her navy blue dress mended so many times the original fabric barely showed. Dust covered her from collar to hem. Her honey blonde hair, once pinned neatly, had surrendered to 3 weeks of trains and stagecoaches, and now hung in loose waves around a face pale with exhaustion and something worse, fear. 3 men looked at her, she looked at 3 men. Nobody spoke for 10 seconds, and those 10 seconds stretched longer than the entire journey from Massachusetts. Then the tallest one moved. He stepped forward, just one step, but the ground seemed to feel it. He stood 6'4", maybe taller, with shoulders wide enough to fill a doorway and hands that looked like they'd been carved from the same stone as the mountains behind him. His jaw was square and dark with 2 days of stubble. His eyes were the color of whiskey held up to firelight and just as warm, which is to say not warm at all. "Who invited you here?" His voice came out low, not loud. A man like this never needed to be loud. The kind of voice that settled into your chest and stayed there. Clara swallowed. Her grip tightened on the valise. She did not know that the man standing before her, Garrett Calloway, owner of the largest ranch in 3 counties, the man half of Montana called Iron Garrett, had no idea she existed until 15 seconds ago. And she certainly did not know that the letter inviting her here had been written by the youngest brother, who was standing behind the other 2, with a face white as chalk, looking like he wanted to crawl into the earth and disappear. But that was only the beginning, because what Clara Whitfield was about to discover at Calloway Ranch would change everything. Not just her life, but the lives of 3 men who had never learned how to live without being alone. Before we go on, if you're new here, hit subscribe. I share new frontier stories every week, and drop a comment below. Where are you listening from tonight now? Let me take you back 3 weeks before Clara arrived. Back to the man who built an empire and forgot to build a life. Garrett Calloway rode his black stallion Phantom along the ridge at sundown, looking out over everything he owned. It was September 1878. The air had already begun to turn. Frost touched the grass each morning, the sky had gone sharper and clearer, and the smell of dry leaves mixed with trail dust carried a warning that needed no words. Winter was coming to Montana Territory. Below him, the Calloway spread stretched in every direction like a kingdom drawn on the earth itself. 40,000 acres of rolling grassland, broken by creeks and cottonwood groves and low hills dotted with scrub oak. 5,000 head of cattle moved across the valley like dark seeds scattered on green cloth. The Bitterroot Mountains stood tall to the west, their peaks already dusted with the season's first snow. And the creek Bitterroot Creek wound through the center of it all like a vein carrying lifeblood. Water, the thing that made everything else possible. Garrett sat still in the saddle, his eyes swept across every ridge, every fence line, every trail, with the cold attention of a man standing guard. There was no pride on his face, no satisfaction, just vigilance, steady and unceasing, like the sun rising each morning, whether anyone asked it to or not. At 33 years old, Garrett Calloway held everything a man could hold in his hands. And still, every night when he rode home, the emptiness was waiting. He had not always been Iron Garrett. There was a time when he was just Garrett, the oldest boy in a family of 6, watching his father lose everything one failed season at a time on a patch of bad soil in Missouri. 6 children in a cabin smaller than his horse barn now. Winters when hunger was the most faithful companion any of them had. He remembered the sound of his youngest sister's stomach growling at midnight, a sound that followed him into sleep for 20 years after. His mother worked until her hands cracked and bled just to keep them together. His father tried, but the Missouri land did not give much. Then one winter, his father fell sick. Pneumonia, the kind of sickness poor men could not afford to cure. Garrett, 16 years old, stood at his father's grave in the snow and made a vow. He would never live like this again. Never depend on anyone. Never come up short. And he had kept that vow. He brought his family west, walked for months, hired out on cattle ranches, and learned everything a man could learn about working land and livestock. Saved every cent. At 22, he bought his first piece of land. 200 acres of scrub nobody wanted priced cheap because nobody believed in it. He turned it into 500, then 1,000, then 5,000. He bought when others sold, invested when others hesitated. By 30, he owned the biggest spread in 3 counties. But somewhere along the way, he had lost something else. His mother passed 3 years ago. In a soft bed in the big limestone house he had built for her. She went peacefully smiling, holding his hand. But the last thing she said was not, "I'm proud," or "You did well." She said, "Find someone, Garrett. Don't grow old alone." He had not kept that promise. 4 of his siblings had scattered to 4 corners, married, built their own lives. Only Boone and Levi stayed at the ranch. And Garrett, who had spent his whole life protecting his family, suddenly realized they had all left. And the big house he built echoed with nothing but his own footsteps. Let me tell you what a day looked like at Cowboy Ranch, because this matters. The men who listen to this story know what real work smells like, and the work is the backbone of everything that follows. Garrett rode Phantom into the ranch yard as the sun touched the western peaks. He had been out since 4 in the morning. First checking the east fence line where 3 posts had loosened after last week's wind and needed replacing. Then moving 200 head from the north pasture down into the lower valley where the grass was better and the water closer for the coming winter. He had to circle a stubborn lead bull 3 times before the animal finally turned the right direction. Patient, precise, never rushed. Cattle did not respond to haste, neither did the land. At the stable, he unsaddled Phantom himself. Always himself, never handed off. His hands moved with practiced ease over the cinch straps, removing the bit running a palm along the stallion's neck. Phantom bumped his nose against Garrett's chest, a habit between 2 creatures who had survived 8 winters together. Garrett did not smile. He rarely smiled. But his hand was gentle on Phantom's mane, and that was how he showed what he felt. He brushed the horse down checked hooves. The left front felt slightly warm, something to watch. He filled water and oats, then walked the length of the stable. 14 horses, each one known by name and temperament. Sugar Bay, who kicked when her stomach hurt. Merchant, who let nobody ride him but Boone. And Goldie, the gentlest mare on the ranch, the one Levi kept for guests or women, though no woman had ever come to ride her. Harlan Mercer met him near the yard gate. Harlan was 55, silver mustache, sharp eyes, and he had been foreman of Cowboy Ranch for 20 years. He gave his report short and clean. The western herd was ready to move tomorrow. Grass at Cotton Run looked good. Garrett nodded, told him to check the southern ravines before moving anything. They had lost 30 head there last spring to a slide. Then Harlan mentioned something else. Vivian Prescott had sent another supper invitation. The 6th this month. Garrett's jaw tightened. "Burn it." Harlan gave a dry laugh. "This ranch needs heirs, boss. Folks are starting to wonder if you plan to die alone." Garrett turned and fixed him with a look cold enough to freeze Bitterroot Creek in July. "When I need opinions about my private life, I'll ask." But the words followed him into the house. The limestone house was big. Garrett had built it for his mother. Walls a foot thick, keeping warm in winter, cool in summer. Real glass windows, not the oiled paper most frontier homes used. Oak plank floors, polished smooth. A stone fireplace large enough for a man to stand inside. And a dining table oak long enough to seat 12. Only one plate had been set. Cordelia, the housekeeper, 60 years old, silver-haired, strong-handed, and warm-eyed, had made beef stew with beans and cornbread. She set the plate before Garrett poured black coffee and left without a word. She knew when silence was the right offering. Garrett ate alone. The sound of his fork against the plate echoed in the dining room. Through the window, he could see lantern light flickering in the Mary quarters. Ranch hands with wives heading home. Through the glass, he imagined what lay inside those lit windows. Women setting tables, men lifting children, laughter, the clatter of dishes, simple sounds, normal sounds, sounds he did not have. Later, whiskey in hand, Garrett stood at the study window. The ledger lay open on his desk. Profits, expenses, expansion plans. Numbers that had once been everything. Each dollar earned had once meant distance from Missouri poverty. But now looking at the page, he saw only paper. This ranch needs heirs. Harlan's words circled back like vultures over the Montana sky. Garrett stared into the dark glass, and the man staring back was someone he did not like. Now let me tell you about the two brothers, because this story does not belong to Garrett alone. Boone Calloway was 30 years old and lived like a fire that nobody could control, including himself. The next morning, while Garrett saddled Phantom before dawn, Boone was already in the stable, cinching up Merchant, the big brown horse that only he could ride. Boone was not the type to rise early from discipline. He rose early because he could not sleep. He had always been this way. Restless, full of energy, needing movement the way most men needed air. If Garrett solved problems with cold patience, Boone solved them with fists. Not because he was stupid. Boone was smart in his own way. He could read cattle the way some men read books, sensing a shift in the herd before it happened, predicting weather by the angle of the wind. But he also read insult where none existed, and he swung before his brain finished thinking. 3 months back, Boone had nearly brawled with two of Silas Drummond's ranch hands at the Silver Bend Saloon. They had said something about the Calloway family, and Boone flipped out of the table before the third word left their mouths. Harlan had to drag him out. Garrett said nothing afterward, just looked at Boone, and the look in his eyes was worse than anger or disappointment. It was the tired expression of a man who had stopped expecting better. "He treats me like a child," Boone once told Levi. "I'm not a child." "Then don't act like one," Levi answered quietly, and Boone said nothing more because Levi was the only person who could say that without Boone walking away. Levi Calloway, 25, was the youngest and different from his brothers, the way water is different from stone and fire. He flowed around everything, patient, quiet, watching. That morning, while his brothers rode out, Levi stayed behind at the horse corral, working with a wild Mustang they had caught the week before. The horse was gray eyes white with fear, kicking at anyone who came close. Levi did not go close. He sat outside the fence back against a post reading a book. Every few minutes he spoke, low even, no threat in his voice, not saying anything specific, just the sound of a human. The Mustang pinned its ears, at first stamped and snorted. After an hour, it stood still. After 2, its ears turned toward Levi. After 3, it walked to the fence and placed its nose in his hand. That was Levi, never forced, just waited. And for the past year, Levi had been waiting and watching, and what he saw kept him awake at night. 3 months before Clara arrived, Levi witnessed something that changed everything. He had come into the stable to check on a foaling mare and found Garrett on the floor, not fallen from tripping. Garrett had suddenly grabbed his head, gone white as bone, and dropped to his knees. He stayed there for 2 full minutes, breathing hard, eyes squeezed shut. Then he stood, straightened his coat, and walked out as if nothing had happened. He did not know anyone had seen. Levi said nothing, but he started watching. Garrett rubbed his temples when he thought no one was looking. Sometimes he squinted at things close up as if his vision had blurred. Some nights, heavy footsteps paced the hallway at 3 in the morning, back and forth, back and forth. Garrett could not sleep, or perhaps was afraid to. And once when Levi asked if he was feeling all right, something crossed Garrett's face, not anger, fear, just a flash gone and a second buried behind the iron mask. Levi did not know what was wrong with his brother, but he knew this: if Garrett died, the ranch had no heir, no wife, no children, no future. And Garrett would never find a wife on his own, too proud, too stubborn, too afraid of closeness. So Levi did something he knew Garrett would never forgive. He placed an advertisement for a mail-order bride in an Eastern newspaper. Large ranch in Montana Territory seeks young woman of good character, willing for frontier life. Good home, vast land, stable future. Preference for someone literate, incapable of household management. Write to L. Calloway, Silver Bend, Montana Territory. He signed it L. Calloway. Did not specify which brother. Boone did not know. Garrett certainly did not. And 2 weeks ago, a reply had come. Now let me take you east. 3 months earlier, the winter of 1877 into 1878, Massachusetts, Clara Whitfield, 21 years old, sat shivering in a small room above the Pruitt General Store in Millfield, a town 40 miles west of Boston. The cold was deep enough to turn breath to fog. The blanket was thin patched so many times the original cloth had nearly vanished. On the wooden table sat a stub of candle, a crust of dry bread, a cup of water, and an old newspaper someone had used to wrap fish. 6 months ago, Clara had a family. Her father, Reverend Josiah Whitfield, had been a man who loved books more than money. He taught Clara to read at 3, to write at 5, to do arithmetic at 7, and even basic Latin by 12. He believed knowledge was the one thing nobody could take from you. Her mother, a gentlewoman with clever hands who sewed clothes for half the neighborhood, was the one who held everything together when Josiah forgot the real world existed because he was lost in Scripture. Then the fever swept through Millfield, took both of them in the same week. Josiah first, her mother 3 days later. Clara buried them with borrowed money in the rain, with 2 neighbors helping carry the coffins. Now what did she have? The cold room above the Pruitt store. Work from dawn to dark, sweeping stocking shelves, serving customers. Wages that barely existed traded for a roof and one thin meal a day. Margaret Pruitt, the store owner, was not cruel on purpose. She simply treated Clara as a tool. "Those shelves won't stock themselves," she said each morning, and Clara moved faster. But Vernon Pruitt, Margaret's husband, was a different problem entirely. Vernon was middle-aged, smelled of tobacco and something sour, and had a smile that moved too slowly across his face. Over 6 months, he had been closing the distance step by step. Compliments first. "Such a pretty thing. A girl like you needs protecting." Then the accidental touches. A hand brushing her back as she passed, fingers grazing her wrist when handing over stock. And lately he had begun cornering her in quiet parts of the store when Margaret napped upstairs. "You don't have to live like this, girl. I could make things easier." His voice low, his hand moving slowly as if he had all the time in the world. Clara knew where it was heading. She was not naive. She had seen how women without family, without dowry, without protection, ended up in small towns like this. They became servants for life, or worse, and she knew she was standing on the edge. That night by candlelight, her fingers moved across the advertisement page of the old newspaper. Most of it was patent medicine, land sales, mining, recruitment. Then her eyes stopped. "Large ranch in Montana Territory seeks young woman of good character." Clara read it 3 times. Her heart beat faster, not just from fear, but from something new, something bold. Montana. 2,000 miles. She had never traveled more than 50 miles from Millfield. She knew nothing about cattle, about prairies, about frontier life. But she could read and write, she could do arithmetic, and she knew that if she stayed here one more winter, Vernon Pruitt would take the last thing she still had. She wrote her reply that same night. Honest, orphan, no estate, but literate, numerate, and willing to work hard. She said nothing about Vernon Pruitt, nothing about the fear that crawled through her each night, nothing about feeling trapped in a life with no exit. 3 weeks later, a reply arrived. Brief, polite, with a one-way train ticket and stagecoach fare enclosed. "We look forward to your arrival. L. Calloway." Clara held the ticket in her hand, one way. No road back. The next morning, before Margaret woke, before Vernon returned from the saloon, Clara Whitfield left Millfield forever. She carried a worn leather valise containing 2 dresses, her father's Bible with his careful marginal notes in slanted handwriting, her mother's ivory comb, and the only wedding photograph her parents ever had. The journey from Massachusetts to Montana Territory took nearly 3 weeks. Clara rode 3rd class on the train. Hard wooden benches, no cushions, packed with immigrant families, gold seekers, and women traveling alone like her. Coal smoke blackened everything. The rhythm of wheels on rails became the pulse of distance growing between her and the old life. Through the train window, she watched America change mile by mile. The industrial cities of the East gave way to the vast central plains, land so flat and sky so wide that Clara felt dizzy looking at it. In Massachusetts, the sky had been cut into pieces by rooftops and trees. Out here, it filled everything. She had never seen so much sky in her life. She read her father's Bible each day. Not because she was especially devout, but because his marginal notes written in that careful slanted hand made her feel less alone. Theological reflections, observations about human nature, occasionally a small joke that only her mother would have laughed at. Reading those notes was like receiving letters from the dead. An older woman on the train studied Clara for a long moment. "You're going as a mail-order bride, aren't you?" Clara nodded. "God bless you, child. Men out there aren't always what the letters promise." The final leg was 3 days by stagecoach over red dirt roads through green hills and clear streams and tall pine forests. Dust covered her dress completely. Her hair refused to stay pinned. But when the coach crested the last hill and Clara saw the Bitterroot Valley spread below green meadows, running to snow-capped mountains, the river winding like silver through the center, and the big limestone ranch house sitting in the middle of it all, every ache in her body faded. "Callaway Ranch," the driver said, spitting tobacco. "Biggest in 3 counties. The Callaway men run this land." Clara gripped her valise, hard hammering. This was where her new life began, or ended. Now we come back to where we started. The stagecoach, the dust, the 3 men, and the moment everything began to unravel. The coach stopped at the ranch gate in late afternoon. Dust was still settling when Levi appeared on the porch, face chalk white. He had been expecting this day, had been watching for the confirmation letter for 2 weeks, but seeing the girl actually step down from the coach, real and breathing and small and exhausted, made everything suddenly terrifyingly real. Clara stood in the dusty yard, valise at her feet, looking up at the limestone house. Small, 5'3", slender, road-worn dust on every inch of her navy dress. But her back was straight, her chin was up. Her cornflower blue eyes swept the scene with a mixture of curiosity and caution that was not weakness. It was assessment. Levi came down the steps. "Miss Whitfield?" She nodded. "Mr. Callaway." "Levi," he said quickly. "I'm Levi Callaway." Then he stopped as if he did not know what came next, because truthfully he did not. Before Levi could say more, Boone appeared from the direction of the corral, sweat on his shoulders, dust on his boots. He stopped when he saw Clara, eyes wide, then narrowed. "Who's this?" Levi swallowed. "This is Miss Clara Whitfield. She's from Massachusetts." The sound of hooves. Garrett would phantom into the yard, dust trailing behind like a cape. He swung down, strode toward the house. "Stagecoach at the gate. Who's here?" Then he saw her. He stopped mid-stride. His whiskey-colored eyes, cold and steady in every other moment of his life, locked onto Clara. She had to tilt her head back to meet them. He was nearly 1.5 feet taller than her, built like something the land itself had made. Hard face, sun-darkened jaw set. The kind of man who did not bend. Not for weather, not for debt, not for anyone. "Who is this?" Lower now. Levi took a breath. "She's a mail-order bride. I placed the advertisement." The silence that followed had weight, physical weight, like the air before a thunderstorm. Garrett's face moved through a sequence of expressions almost too fast to read. Confusion, understanding, pure, clean anger. His jaw locked. The tendon in his temple jumped. His fists closed at his sides. "What did you do?" "I placed an ad for a wife, for you." "For me." Not a question. "You decided what I need. You put an advertisement in a newspaper inviting a complete stranger here on my money without asking me." "You would never have agreed if I asked," Levi said, and that was the truth. Boone stood to the side, his eyes jumping between his brothers. But then he looked at Clara, really looked. She was standing there, valise at her feet, face draining of color, as she realized she had traveled 2,000 miles to a place that did not want her. She was afraid, not the ordinary kind. The fear of someone who has just run out of ground to stand on. "Garrett," Boone's voice was hard but steady. "Whatever you want to say, save it. Look at her eye." And Garrett followed Boone's gaze. For the first time, he truly saw Clara. Not as a problem to be solved, but as a person. Small, tired, dust-covered, but standing straight. Something in her eyes that Garrett recognized because he had it himself. Dignity. She was not begging, not crying, just standing there looking at him directly, waiting for the verdict. Garrett breathed deep, then said in a voice still hard but lower, inside, "All of us." Cordelia moved fast. She had Clara in the kitchen within a minute, a cup of hot tea in her hands, fresh bread and butter on a plate. "Don't you worry, child. Their bark is worse than their bite." Clara thanked her, but her hands still trembled around the cup. In the study, 3 brothers faced each other. Garrett stood by the window, back turned. Boone sat in the armchair, boots up on the desk, looking casual in a way that fooled no one. Levi stood near the door, braced for whatever came. Levi told everything. The advertisement, the reply letter, the ticket money he had taken from the ranch account. He told everything except the real reason. He did not mention Garrett's headaches, the episodes of lost vision, the fear that his oldest brother was slowly dying. Instead, he said simply, "The ranch needs an heir. You'll never look on your own. So I did it for you." "You had no right," Garrett said, voice like a blade. "Maybe not, but I did it, and she's here." Boone spoke up, surprising everyone, including himself. "The question isn't why. The question is what now? She traveled 2,000 miles. She has no family back east. If we send her back, where does she go?" Then Boone delivered the blow that actually landed family honor Garrett. The Calloway name made a promise. You invite a woman 2,000 miles and then send her back, our reputation cracks. And reputation is the only thing keeping this ranch safe from men like Silas Drummond. Garrett knew Boone was right. On the frontier, honor was not abstract. It was currency. He stood silent for a long time, jaw clenched, staring at the floor. Then he said, "She stays, but not as a bride." "Then as what?" Boone asked. "Housekeeper. Bookkeeper. We need someone to manage supplies, accounts, household. Cordelia's getting older. She deserves rest. If this girl can read and write and do figures like she claims she has a job, if not, she has time to find somewhere else." Garrett delivered the decision to Claire himself. He walked into the kitchen where she sat with Cordelia, stood at the head of the table, hands flat on the oak surface, and spoke without decoration. Housekeeper, bookkeeper, fair wages, private room. Nobody would touch her. And he emphasized this part, his voice going hard as railroad iron. No marriage. This was a work arrangement. Clara listened. Her face showed nothing, a skill Yipao had learned during months under the Pruitt roof. Inside, a storm of emotions churned. Relief that she was not being sent away. Disappointment that the promise in the advertisement had turned to dust. Wounded pride at the way Garrett spoke, as if she were a logistics problem rather than a human being. But she said, "I agree. Thank you, Mr. Calloway." Garrett nodded once and left. When the door closed, Cordelia looked at Clara with knowing eyes. "Don't listen to what those men say. This house needs you more than they know." Clara was shown to her room. It was the largest room she had ever slept in. A real bed. White linen sheets, clean and crisp. A window that opened onto the prairie, miles of grass rolling to the mountains, under a sky turning violet with evening. She stood in the doorway for a full minute, afraid to step inside, as if entering would make it all disappear. Then she stepped in, sat on the edge of the bed, and for the first time since her parents died, she cried. Not from sadness, from relief so deep it hurt. "You're home now, even if you don't know it yet." Clara proved her value on the very first day. The ranch books were chaos. Garrett was brilliant at making money, but terrible at recording it. Invoices piled up, receipts went missing, income and expenses did not match. Clara sat down at the desk with the mountain of papers and began sorting with the cold precision her father had taught her. Within 3 days, she had balanced 2 months of accounts and discovered the ranch was being overcharged on shipping fees from the freight company Boone had contracted. When she pointed out the error, Boone looked at her for a long moment. "Nobody caught that in 2 years," he said, voice flat but eyes impressed. Then he nodded. "I'll call the freight company." Levi treated Clara with careful gentleness, the kindness of someone carrying guilt. He knew she had come because of him. He knew she had expected marriage, a family, a new beginning, and instead received a poem and a boss made of ice. He tried to make up for it in small ways. He walked her around the ranch, introduced her to the horses. "This is Goldie, gentlest mare we have. You can ride her anytime." He taught her to tell wolf tracks from coyote tracks. He showed her how to read Montana clouds. Thin white clouds meant fair weather. Low gray clouds from the west meant rain. Black clouds rolling in tight spirals meant a storm. And when those came, you ran. Garrett kept his distance. He ate breakfast before Clara came downstairs. He ate dinner in his study. He communicated through notes tucked into the ledger. Short, precise instructions, as if she were a bank clerk, not a person living under the same roof. But Clara noticed things. She noticed his coffee went black when his mind was heavy, and he forgot the cup entirely when his mood lightened. She noticed his shoulders tighten every time Harlan mentioned Silas Drummond. She noticed the heavy footsteps pacing the hallway at 2-3 in the morning, the sound that had become a strangely familiar lullaby for her own restless sleep. And she noticed something else that nobody seemed to see. Sometimes in the middle of a morning, Garrett would press his hand to his temple and close his eyes, just for a few seconds. Then he would lower his hand, open his eyes, and continue as if nothing had happened. But in those few seconds, Iron Garrett cracked open, and beneath the iron was pain. Clara did not ask. It was not yet time. But she remembered. She filed it away the same way she filed invoices. Carefully, completely, for when it would matter. The first mistake Clara made was washing the dining room floor with hot water, the way she had been taught in Massachusetts. Cordelia stopped her immediately. Hot water swells the oak. Cold water, damp cloth, follow the grain. Things work different out here, child. Clara remembered. From that day, the oak floor in the dining room stayed clean and undamaged. The second mistake was feeding wheat to the horses instead of oats. Levi caught it in time. Wheat causes bloat in horses, can kill them. Clara went pale. Levi put a hand on her shoulder, light and brief. Now you know. Knowing is more important than never being wrong. Clara remembered. She made a list of feed for every animal on the ranch, posted it in the kitchen, and nobody had to correct her twice. The third mistake was the one the entire ranch remembered for years. Clara tried to carry 2 water buckets from the well to the kitchen, not knowing the back porch was slick with morning frost. She slipped. Both buckets went flying, soaking her from head to foot, and she sat in a puddle in the backyard, hair in her face, dress, drenched, mouth open in pure surprise. Boone had been repairing a saddle nearby. He heard the crash and came running. He looked at her sitting in the puddle, and he laughed. A real laugh, uncontrolled, so loud that Harlan heard it from the stable, and Cordelia heard it from the kitchen. But even as Boone laughed, he offered his hand. Come on up, you go. Montana buckets are heavier than Massachusetts buckets, huh? Clara took his hand, stood, looked down at herself, soaked and muddy with a leaf in her hair, and she laughed too. Not the small, careful laugh she used in town. Real laughter, bright, uncontrolled, the kind that filled empty spaces. They laughed for 2 solid minutes. Every time they nearly stopped, Boone looked at the puddle, and Clara looked at the leaf in her hand, and it started again. Levi heard from the stable and smiled. Cordelia heard from the kitchen and wiped her eyes on her apron. And Garrett, repairing equipment in the tool shed, stopped what he was doing. He did not look out, but he listened. Laughter echoing across the ranch yard, warm and alive. And Garrett realized he had forgotten that sound, had forgotten it lived in the world. That evening, when Boone retold the story at dinner with considerable exaggeration, 2 buckets became 4, and a slip became an ice skating performance. Garrett glanced at Clara across the table. She was laughing, eyes bright, cheeks flushed from the kitchen heat, hair tucked behind her ear. And something inside Garrett's chest, something that had been frozen for a very long time, began to warm. He looked away quickly, but Cordelia, pouring tea, saw everything. There are changes so small that only an old woman in a kitchen notices them, but the old woman knows that the smallest changes are always the ones that matter most. Actions, not words. That's how a person earns their place on the frontier. One afternoon during the second week, the Montana wind shifted without warning. It came from the northwest, sudden and sharp, strong enough to peel tin from the auxiliary stable roof and flatten 200 feet of the east fence line. 40 head of cattle pushed through the gap and drifted toward the southern ravines. Garrett, Boone, and every available hand rode out immediately. Harlan split them into 2 groups, half to chase cattle, half to repair the fence before dark. But there were not enough men for both. Clara stood on the porch watching the chaos. Then she took off her apron and walked straight into the yard. I can help with the fence, she told Harlan. Harlan looked at her. Small housekeeper's hands never driven a fence post in her life. But he was short on men. Know how to swing a hammer. My father taught me, she said. Josiah Whitfield, though a minister, had still maintained his own house. Harlan paired her with Levi. They worked side by side through the afternoon. Levi dug post holes with a pry bar, while Clara held each post plumb as he drove it down with a sledgehammer. Her hands blistered within the first hour. She did not stop. Her back ached. She did not stop. Sweat and dust mixed into mud on her face. She did not stop. Levi, the quietest of the brothers, spoke more that afternoon than he had in weeks. He explained the angle of the posts tilted slightly outward so that cattle pushing against the fence would press it tighter rather than push it over. He showed her how to twist the barbed wire 3 wraps cinched with pliers, ends tucked flat so cattle would not tear their hides on exposed points. By sunset, the fence was standing. Not as clean as professional work, but solid. Garrett rode Phantom back from the ravines, 38 of the 40 had recovered. He swung down, walked the fence line, ran his hand along the wire, tested each post. Then he looked at Clara. She stood there, hair tangled, face dirty, hands raw with blisters, the hem of her dress torn by barbed wire. Small, exhausted, and she had not complained once. Garrett said nothing, just nodded, short and brief. But Levi saw. That nod from Iron Garrett carried more weight than any praise Clara had ever received in her life. She'd earned it, every part of it. That evening, Clara found something on the table in her room, a pair of leather work gloves, small size new. No note, nobody claimed them. But only one person on the ranch would have known that Clara's hands were too small for every pair of gloves in the supply shed. Garrett. And so the days passed. Clara working, learning, fitting herself into the fabric of the ranch with a quiet determination that earned grudging respect from the hands, open warmth from Cordelia, careful friendship from Levi, rough humor from Boone and from Garrett, a distance that was not quite indifference. By the end of the second week, Clara had settled into the rhythm of the ranch like a hand sliding into a well-worn glove. She rose before dawn to the sound of the rooster, built a fire in the big cast-iron stove, the way Cordelia taught her paper first, then small kindling stacked like a tent, then larger wood blowing gently from below until the flame caught. Ground coffee beans by hand, boiled them in the copper kettle strained through thin cloth. The smell of fresh coffee filling the limestone house each morning became a new signal. Clara was up. The house was alive. Breakfast was ranch-scale cooking. Fried eggs from the yard hens, thick-cut bacon, cornbread baked in the iron skillet, sometimes oatmeal with honey. This was not the delicate breakfast of the East. This was fuel for men who would work 14 hours outdoors. Clara learned to cook big and cook fast. She burned her hands a few times, at first the cast iron running hotter than the small stove in Millfield, but she did not complain. Cordelia watched and nodded. You'll do. During the days, Clara managed the books. But not only the books. Cordelia gradually handed over more. Inventory of the food stores. How many bags of flour? How many barrels of sugar? How many pounds of salt for curing? Enough for winter or not, shopping lists for the town run. The laundry schedule, sunny days for bed sheets, windy days for heavy clothing. Even the veterinary supply closet, antiseptic, dewormer, pine oil. Levi taught her to tell them apart. The work was not romantic. Clara's hands changed, from soft Massachusetts hands to calloused frontier hands. Her fingertips cracked from cold water and lye soap. Her back ached from bending over ledgers and standing at the stove. But every time she completed a task, balanced a book, stocked a shelf, served a meal on time, she felt something she had never felt in Millfield. Purpose. He still ate breakfast early, still retreated to his study for dinner, still communicated through notes. But the notes grew slightly longer. Check the September fence post order became check the September fence post order, might need extra for the south line. And once tucked between 2 invoices, a single line that made Clara stop and reread it 3 times. The books look good, thank you. 4 words. From Iron Garrett, that was a standing ovation. At night, Clara stood at her bedroom window and looked out over the prairie under moonlight. She had been here 2 weeks. She had a roof of job food, but she did not yet belong. She looked down at her hands. They had changed. Not soft anymore, but not yet the calloused hands of a frontier woman. She was in between old and new, between fear and hope, between 3 men she did not yet understand. From her window, she could see the light in Garrett's study. He was still awake, always awake. His shadow moved behind the curtains, pacing back and forth like a caged animal. "What are you running from?" Clara whispered to the darkness. No answer came. Only the Montana wind blowing across the prairie, carrying the smell of wet grass and the faint, uncertain promise of something she was not yet brave enough to believe was real. And somewhere in the darkness, from the direction of the creek south of the ranch, the sound of water reached her. Gentle, clear calling. Clara did not know it yet, but that creek would change everything. But what she didn't know was that beneath all the limestone walls and iron fences, The three Calloway men were fighting storms of their own, and the biggest storm, the one that would change everything, hadn't come yet. 3 weeks passed and the house changed. Not in structure, not in the arrangement of furniture or the color of the walls. The change was subtler than that, the way a season turns before anyone marks the calendar. Something in the air shifted. The big limestone house, which had echoed with emptiness for so many years, began to feel inhabited. There was order now, a quiet rhythm that had not existed before. Ledgers balanced clean, supplies arrived on schedule, meals appeared at reliable hours. Curtains were drawn open at exactly the right time to catch morning light, and wildflowers from the prairie appeared in a small clay jar on the dining table, a detail that Cordelia swore she had not placed there. Clara was at the center of all of it, but she moved through the house so lightly she was almost invisible. Up before dawn, coffee brewing, while the sky was still purple. Lists checked, papers sorted, meals planned, while most of the ranch was still pulling on boots. She worked with a precision that Garrett privately admitted, though he would never say it aloud, exceeded anyone he had ever hired. And the distance between Garrett and Clara held. Breakfast across from each other, Garrett eating fast, with his eyes on a newspaper or supply list. Dinner when he was home, 2 plates on a long table far enough apart to be safe, close enough to feel the pull. Short conversations about weather, cattle prices, delivery schedules. Nothing personal, nothing dangerous. But both of them were lying to themselves. Garrett noticed things he had no business noticing. He caught himself listening for Clara's footsteps in the hallway each morning. The soft tread, the slight hesitation on the third stair, the one that creaked, then steadier after that. He noticed how she tucked her hair behind her ear when she was concentrating, how her finger traced down a column of numbers the way some people trace the lines of a map, how she bit her lower lip just barely when she found an error. Small observations that he hated himself for having. Clara, for her part, learned Garrett's rhythms in ways no one else saw. She knew his shoulders tightened on Mondays, the day he checked the western herd near Drummond's land. She knew his coffee went black when his mind was heavy and sat forgotten when it was not. She knew the heavy footsteps in the hallway at 2 and 3 in the morning had become a strangely familiar sound, a kind of lullaby made of loneliness and floorboards. And she kept watching the headaches, the hand pressed to the temple, the eyes squeezed shut, the few seconds when Iron Garrett cracked open and beneath the iron pain lived. She did not ask, not yet. Winter always ends, but some winters last longer than others. One morning before the first light touched the sky, Clara woke gasping. The dream had dragged her back to Millfield. Vernon Pruitt standing too close, his breath sour with whiskey, his hand moving slowly as if he owned time itself. She woke with her heart slamming against her ribs and sweat cold on her neck, and she knew sleep was not coming back. The creek. Levi had told her about it. A wide, clear pool where Bitterroot Creek deepened and slowed, tucked between cottonwood trees that leaned close like guardians. Quietest spot on the ranch, he had said. Water so clear you can see the bottom. Cordelia had mentioned it too. Best time is early morning or late evening. Nobody goes out there at those hours. Nobody goes out there. The words had stayed with Clara like a promise. She dressed in her oldest dress, the one nobody would question if it came back stained or torn. She slipped out the back door into air that wrapped around her like a blessing. Cool, clean, scented with AAE and damp earth, she walked fast, then ran. It felt good, free. Her feet carried her along the narrow trail that followed the creek southward, and the land opened around her as the ranch buildings fell away behind. 3 miles. It did not feel far today. Then she saw it. A wide, still pool where the creek spread in deepened waters, slipping over smooth rocks in a small fall that caught the first edge of dawn light. Cottonwood trees arched overhead, their leaves just beginning to turn gold at the tips. The surface was glass, reflecting a sky shifting from purple to rose. Clara stood at the edge and just looked. Beautiful. Untouched. Private. She looked around carefully. No riders, no voices, no movement but wind and leaves. She was alone. Truly alone. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached for the buttons of her dress. Each piece of clothing she removed felt like shedding something heavier than fabric. The long days, the whispered judgments, the watching eyes, hands that had lingered too long in a general store back east. All of it slipped away layer by layer until she stood at the water's edge in only her white cotton shift. She hesitated, one breath, a pause. Then she stepped forward. The water touched her toes, cool and sharp. She gasped softly, then smiled without meaning to. She moved deeper, slowly, carefully, until the water reached her waist. Then, with a quiet breath, she dipped under. The world vanished. When she came up, water streaming from her hair, something inside her broke loose. She laughed. Not the small, careful laugh she used in town. A real one. Bright, free, alive. She floated on her back, staring up at the sky. Clouds drifted above her like they had nowhere else to be. In this moment, she was not Clara Whitfield, orphan, unwanted bride, and invited housekeeper. She was just Clara, living, free. Time slipped away. She moved through the water without hurry, letting it hold her, letting it take everything heavy and wash it clean. She did not hear the horse, did not hear the slow approach along the trail, did not see the rider crest the hill above her. She only noticed when it was too late. A sharp intake of breath, not her own. Clara froze. Her head snapped up, and there at the edge of the pool, sitting tall on a black stallion, was Garrett Calloway. For a moment, neither of them moved. Time seemed to stretch thin, as if the air itself had forgotten how to breathe. Clara stood in the shallow water, her white shift clinging to her skin, her hair streaming down her shoulders. Every part of her felt exposed. Not just her body, but something deeper, something she had never shown anyone. The freedom she wore when she thought no one was watching. Garrett sat rigid in the saddle. His usual calm was gone. His eyes, cold and controlled in every other moment of his life, were wide now, fixed on her. But the thing that stopped his breathing was not beauty, though she was beautiful in the way that dawn, light, and clear water make everything more than it usually is. It was the expression on her face before she knew he was there. Pure, unguarded joy. The look of someone who had, for just a moment, set down every burden she carried. He had never seen that expression on anyone, and he wanted it for himself with a desperation that frightened him. Then it all collapsed. Clara turned and splashed toward the bank hands, trying to cover herself as she reached for her clothes. "I'm sorry, I'm so sorry. I didn't know anyone was here." Garrett's voice came out rough, uncertain, different from any voice he had ever used. He pulled hard on the reins, turning phantom so his back faced her. "I'll go. I apologize." Clara struggled into her dress, the damp fabric clinging stubbornly. Tears blurred her vision, hot and sudden. "Please," she whispered. "Please don't tell anyone. Please forget this happened." Garrett did not turn. "I will," he said quietly. "You have my word." A man keeps his word. The words should have brought comfort. They did not, because something had already changed and no promise could undo it. Clara fastened the last button with trembling hands. She wiped her face, but the tears kept coming. Garrett nudged Phantom forward, but just before he reached the rise, something pulled him back. He glanced over his shoulder. Their eyes met. Only a second. His were darker now, not cold. Something else lived there, something neither of them had a name for yet. Then he was gone over the hill, the sound of hooves fading until the silence returned. But it was not the same silence. It had a different weight now, a different texture, as if the air between those two people had been permanently rearranged. Clara stood alone by the creek, the water still lapping gently at the rocks, and she knew that the moment which had felt like freedom now carried something else entirely. She had been seen, not by just anyone, by him. She forced herself to stand, gathered what strength she had left, and began the long walk back, each step heavier than the last. By the time she reached the back door, her absence had gone unnoticed. Nothing had changed, and everything had changed. 3 days passed. Garrett Calloway tried to bury himself in work. The numbers refused to hold his attention. Conversations drifted off halfway through. Even the steady rhythm of ranch life felt slightly off-center, as if the axis of the world had tilted by a single degree, too small for anyone else to notice, too large for him to ignore. Harlan noticed first. "You sure you're all right, boss?" he asked one morning, watching Garrett stare across the yard like he had forgotten why he was standing there. "Fine," Garrett said, too quickly. Harlan was not convinced, but he knew when to stop asking. The truth was simple and unbearable. Garrett could not stop thinking about her. The image had branded itself into his mind like a hot iron pressed to hide. The water, the light, the way she had looked before she realized he was there. Free in a way he had never seen in anyone. He had seen beautiful women before, plenty of them. Vivian Prescott was beautiful. Half the women at church socials were beautiful. None of them had undone him like this, and that was the problem, because it was not beauty that kept him awake. It was joy. The kind of joy he had spent 33 years building walls against. The kind he had decided somewhere between Missouri poverty and Montana empire that he did not deserve. On the fourth day, Garrett made a decision he did not fully understand. He rode into Silver Bend, telling himself it was for supplies. Even he knew that was not the real reason. The town was alive with its usual movement, wagons creaking along the main street, dust rising in lazy clouds. He tied Phantom outside the Pruitt General Store. Why he chose the Pruitt store instead of the larger mercantile down the street was something he chose not to examine too closely. Inside, Margaret Pruitt transformed instantly from sharp to sweet. "Mr. Calloway, what an honor. How can we help you today?" He pulled out a supply list. While Margaret bustled about gathering items, Vernon Pruitt emerged from the back room. He saw Garrett and paused, then sidled closer after Margaret disappeared behind the shelves. "Here you've got yourself a new little helper," Vernon said, his voice low and familiar, in a way that made the air in the room change temperature. "The Whitfield girl. Used to work for us, you know." Garrett did not turn. "Sweet thing," Vernon continued. "Knows how to mine, how to make a man comfortable." His smile crept wider. "If you get tired of her, send her back this way. We always have room for a girl who knows how to cooperate." The world stopped. Garrett turned. Slowly, the way a thunderhead turns silent before everything breaks apart. "Say that again." Vernon's smile faltered. "I just meant that." "Get out." Vernon blinked. "This is my—" "Get out." And this time Vernon read something in those amber eyes that was not ordinary anger. It was the kind of fury a man only carries when someone touches something he protects, something that matters. Vernon stepped back, turned, disappeared through the back door. When Margaret returned with the supplies, her husband's absence went without comment. Garrett paid, nodded, and left. Halfway back to the ranch, the truth caught up with him at a full gallop. He was not angry because Vernon Pruitt said something disgusting. He was angry because Vernon Pruitt said something disgusting about Clara. And the difference between those two things, the difference between general righteousness and personal rage, told him that the situation was far more dangerous than he had imagined. Garrett Calloway was starting to care. And for a man who had spent his entire life building walls, that was more frightening than any enemy. The mountain doesn't care, but I do. The following Sunday, Clara went to church. Cordelia had advised it. If you hide, they'll think you have something to hide. The Silver Bend church was small, white clapboard, the steeple leaning slightly from years of wind. When Clara walked through the doors, the whispering started before she reached the second pew. Eyes followed her like shadows. Some held curiosity, others held judgment. A few held something sharper. Clara sat down, back straight, chin up. Inside, she was trembling. After the service in the churchyard, Vivian Prescott was waiting. Not by accident. She stood in a circle of women like a queen, holding court, dressed in violet silk, with a wide-brimmed hat and a lace parasol. Her smile was a beautiful weapon. "Miss Whitfield," Vivian's voice carried just far enough, "so good to see you out of the house." She stressed house, as though the word itself were something shameful. "You must tell us what it's like living alone with 3 unmarried men. Must keep you very busy." Soft laughter from the group. The implication hung in the air like smoke from a brush fire. Clara had spent 21 years keeping her head down. In Millfield, silence was survival strategy. Swallow the insult, lower the eyes, keep moving. It had kept her alive. But standing here, under Montana sky wide enough to hold the whole world, looking into the cold gray eyes of a woman trying to destroy her reputation out of jealousy, something inside Clara shifted. Something cracked. Something finally said enough. She turned to face Vivian directly. Her voice came out calm, clear, steady. "I work at Calloway Ranch as a housekeeper. I manage the books, the supplies, and the household. That is all." "Oh, of course," Vivian said, her smile like a letter opener. Clara stepped forward, one step. "And if you have any other questions about how I earn my living, Miss Prescott, I suggest you ask Mr. Calloway directly. I'm sure he'd be happy to explain if he ever gets around to answering your dinner invitations. Silence. The blow landed exactly where it was aimed. Everyone in Silver Bend knew Vivian had sent dozens of invitations to Garrett and been refused every single time. To mention it publicly, calmly, without malice, but with perfect precision, was the kind of strike Vivian had not prepared for. Vivian's face went white, then flushed red. Her mouth opened, closed. The group of women around her shifted their weight, their loyalty tilting away like a scale rebalanced. Clara nodded politely, turned and walked toward the wagon. Her back was straight, her step was steady. Inside, her heart was beating hard enough to crack her ribs. Harlan stood by the wagon, eyes bright. He said nothing, just tipped his hat and opened the door for her. On the ride home, Clara looked out over the prairie rolling past, and for the first time since arriving in Montana, she felt like she belonged. She'd earned every part of this life, with her own hands, her own voice, her own straight back. That afternoon before dinner, Clara sat on the back porch mending a shirt. Boone appeared and dropped onto the bench beside her, a block of wood in one hand and a small knife in the other. He carved while she sewed. For a while, neither spoke. Then Boone said without looking up, "You were brave at the church today." "I was terrified," Clara answered, also not looking up. "Nobody could tell." "That was the point." Boone laughed softly, then went quiet again. The knife whispered against the wood. After a long pause, he spoke. "I'm jealous." Clara glanced at him. "Not of Garrett," he said quickly. "Of how you fight. You use your head. I use my fists. Always have. And fists don't solve a woman like Vivian Prescott." Clara watched him carve. The shape emerging from the wood was surprisingly delicate for hands that large. A small horse detailed and careful. "Fists have their uses," she said. "When wolves come, I don't want someone reading poetry at them. I want someone who hits back." Boone looked at her and grinned. A real grin, warm and grateful. "But," Clara added, her eyes bright, "maybe learning one more weapon wouldn't hurt. Besides fists." Boone nodded, looked at the half-carved horse in his hand. "You carve well," Clara said. He shrugged. "Just something I do when I'm thinking. It's nothing." "It's not nothing," Clara said quietly. "You have more in you than you think, Boone. More than fists." He did not answer, but that night he set the finished horse on the kitchen shelf where everyone could see it, and he did not explain why. That evening dinner was just the two of them. Boone was out on night watch with the herd. Levi was in the stable with the new Mustang. The long table held 2 plates, 2 glasses, and the quiet sound of fire crackling in the big stone hearth. Firelight moved on the walls like living things, and the smell of burning oak filled the room with something that felt for the first time like warmth. Garrett set down his fork. "I want to be clear. You're here as an employee, nothing else, so Clara lowered her eyes. "I know what people are saying." His jaw hardened. "They're wrong. That won't stop them." "No," he admitted, "but it doesn't make them right." Silence. The fire popped. Then Garrett asked, his voice dropping lower, "That morning at the creek, why were you there?" Clara hesitated, then answered, her eyes lifting to meet his. "I wanted to feel clean, not just from dirt, from everything." They looked at each other across the table. Firelight cast long shadows on the oak floor. The room felt smaller. The table felt shorter. "I understand that," Garrett said quietly. Clara's brow furrowed. When have you ever been anything but this?" She gestured faintly at the room around them. Garrett was silent for a moment. Then he leaned back and something in his voice shifted, dropping beneath the surface into water that had been still for years. "When I was a boy, I wasn't Garrett Calloway. I was just the oldest kid watching my father lose everything one bad season after another. 6 of us in a cabin you could cross in 8 steps. Winters, when we didn't have enough to eat. I remember my mother's hands bleeding from the wash and my youngest sister crying from hunger at midnight." He paused. "That sound, I still hear it sometimes." Clara listened, still and quiet. "I swore at my father's grave that I'd never live like that again. Never need anyone, never come up short." He looked at his hands, scarred and calloused, resting on the table. "And I kept that vow, but somewhere on the road I stopped being anything else." The words hung between them. Heavy, honest, stripped of every wall he had built. Clara saw him differently now. Not just the man people feared, the boy he had buried under iron and ambition and 40,000 acres of Montana land. You deserved that moment at the creek, Garrett said, his voice rough with something that was not anger. More than anyone I've seen in a long time. Her eyes softened. Something warm passed between them, unspoken, uncertain, fragile, as new ice on a November creek. There, but not yet solid. Not yet safe to step on. Then Garrett cleared his throat, catching himself. I'll be away for a few days. Business in town. The distance was placed back where something had begun to close. Clara recognized the retreat. She understood it. Good night, Miss Whitfield. Good night, Mr. Calloway. He left the room. Clara sat alone at the long table, her hands resting on the oak, her heart feeling different. Still unsure, still guarded, but no longer alone in the way it had been before. The mountain doesn't care, but the people on the mountain do. And sometimes that is the only thing that keeps the cold from winning. One afternoon during the 4th week, Clara was bringing papers from the study to the supply shed when she heard a sound from the horse stable. Not a crash, something smaller, like a pen dropping on a wooden floor. She glanced through the half-open stable door. Garrett was sitting on the bench inside both hands, gripping his head, his face bent close to his knees. His shoulders were shaking. Not violently, just a tremor, like a man trying to hold something together that wanted desperately to come apart. He stayed like that for nearly a full minute. Clara counted every second, her own heart hammering, not daring to breathe. Then he inhaled, slowly lifted his head, and continued grooming Phantom as if nothing had happened. Clara stepped back from the door. Her pulse was racing. He was not all right, that much was certain. The episodes were getting worse, more frequent. She had been noting them in her mind, the way she noted everything with the careful attention her father had taught her. But she was the housekeeper. She had no standing to ask, no right to worry, except she did worry. And the worry was not professional. It was personal. And that frightened her almost as much as the headaches frightened Garrett. Then Silas Drummond came. One evening, just as the light was fading from the sky, a rider appeared at the ranch gate. Thin man, pale gray eyes, a smile that never carried warmth. Silas Drummond was 48 years old and owned a ranch on the dry side of the valley land that would have been worthless without water. And the water he wanted ran through Calloway land. Garrett met him in the yard, flanked by Boone on his left and Harlan on his right. Levi watched from the porch, quiet, coiled. Silas dismounted with the ease of a man who believed he held the winning hand. He pulled a rolled document from his saddlebag, old-looking, yellowed edges worn. Transfer of water rights for Bitterroot Creek. Silas said, his voice smooth as oiled leather. Signed in 1856. Certified by the territorial registrar. The water rights belong to my land, Calloway. Always have. Garrett took the document. Read it by lantern light, his face giving nothing away. His jaw tightened, but that was the only sign. This is a forgery, he said flatly. The court won't think so. I've filed for a hearing, 3 weeks from today. If you can't produce original proof of your water claim, the court rules in my favor. Silas smiled that thin smile. No water, no cattle, no ranch. Simple arithmetic. The silence that followed was the dangerous kind, the kind that comes before lightning. Get off my land, Garrett said. His voice was calm, and the calm was the most threatening part. Silas tipped his hat, mounted, and rode away into the dusk. Garrett stood motionless for 5 minutes after Drummond disappeared. Then he went inside straight to his study and began tearing through every drawer, every file cabinet, every box of old papers, searching for the original land deed from when his father purchased the ranch. He could not find it. His father, Ezekiel Calloway, had bought this land in 1860 from a previous owner. The bill of sale should have been somewhere in these records, but Ezekiel had not been a careful keeper of documents. Many had been lost in the shed fire of 1869. The rest were scattered through the chaos that Clara had been slowly organizing since her first day. Late that night, Clara walked past the study and saw the light burning, heard the sound of drawers being pulled open, papers turning, the heavy breathing of a man running out of options. She knocked. Can I help? Garrett looked up. His eyes, for the first time since she had known him, were unguarded. Tired, worried, close to something that looked like fear. I need to find the original land deed. from when my father bought this ranch." Clara sat down. They searched together through the night, side by side, turning old papers page by page with the patience and care of people who understood that the answer was somewhere in this mountain of yellow documents. They did not talk much, but the silence between them was different now. It was the silence of two people fighting the same fight, stronger together than apart. And then Clara found something that stopped her cold. Deep in a crate of old documents that nobody had touched in years, her fingers closed on a letter. Yellow paper, faded ink, dated 1858. The return address read Reverend J. Whitfield, Bitterroot Valley, Montana Territory, addressed to a lawyer in St. Louis. The content discussed land ownership, specifically a parcel along Bitterroot Creek that I purchased and registered lawfully under territorial law. Clara read it 3 times. Reverend J. Whitfield, Bitterroot Valley, 1858. Her father's name was Josiah Whitfield. He was a minister. He had never once mentioned Montana, never spoken of the West. As far as Clara knew, he had lived his entire life in Massachusetts. But here in handwriting, she recognized instantly the same careful slanted script she had been reading in his Bible margins. For years, her father had lived in Montana. Her father had owned land here, right where Callaway Ranch now stood. Clara sat motionless for 10 minutes, the letter trembling in her hands. Why had he never said? Why did he leave? What happened? And most important, if her father's original ownership documents still existed somewhere, what did they mean for the ranch, for the water rights, for everything? She slipped the letter into her father's Bible between the pages of Ruth. She did not tell anyone, not yet. She needed to understand the full picture first. But what she found in that letter would change everything, not just the future, the past as well. The sky turned wrong on a Tuesday afternoon. Heavy, still, thick as wool. By evening, the clouds had stacked into something cold and dark along the western horizon, and thunder rolled low and long across the valley floor, like the growl of something enormous, waking up. "Big one coming," Harlan said, cinching down the barn doors while the hands scrambled to secure everything that could move. "Bigger than anything I've seen in years." Clara stood on the front porch watching the sky collapse. Something deeper than weather unsettled her. Her parents had died during storm season. Not killed by the storm itself, but in her memory, the two things were tangled together so tightly they could not be separated. The sound of rain hammering windows and the sound of her mother's last cough, thunder and grief, storm and loss. Levi was inside helping Cordelia shutter the windows. Boone was in the stable checking on the horses, his voice loud and rough and strangely calming as he moved from stall to stall. But Garrett was not back. He had ridden out at dawn to check the western herd near the boundary with Drummond's land. He should have returned hours ago. But the sky had darkened faster than anyone expected, and Garrett was still out there somewhere. Clara watched the western horizon. Wind was rising now, pulling at her hair, pressing her dress flat against her legs. The first drops of rain hit the porch boards, heavy as pebbles. "Where is he?" she asked Harlan, her voice cutting through the wind. Harlan looked at the sky. Worry creased his weathered face. "Should have been back by now." Then through the curtain of rain that was thickening by the second, Clara saw him. A lone rider cutting through the rising wind, driving hard toward the ranch. Phantom's black shape was almost invisible against the dark sky, visible only in the white flash of lightning. But something was wrong. Garrett was not sitting straight, not riding with the controlled, upright posture she had come to know. He was leaning to one side, one hand on the reins, the other pressed against his head. A headache. In the middle of a storm, on a horse at full gallop. Clara did not think. She ran. Wind hit her like a wall. Rain came down sharp and cold, soaking her in seconds. But she did not stop. Her heart slammed against her ribs as she crossed the yard, cleared the fence, ran straight toward the incoming horse. Garrett saw her. Through the pain, through the rain, through the lightning that turned the world to stutter flash, white and black, he saw her running toward him. Small against the storm, blonde hair plastered to her face, dress soaked through, but running straight and sure, not hesitating. Phantom thundered into the yard. Garrett came off the saddle, more falling than dismounting. His boots hit the ground heavy and unsteady. Clara was there, her small hands gripping his arm, holding him upright with a stubbornness that had nothing to do with size. "What were you doing out there?" she shouted over the wind, her voice carrying both fear and fury. "You could have been killed." "I'm fine." But his knee buckled and Clara caught him. She was small against him, her shoulder barely reaching his chest, but she held on with everything she had, and she did not let go. He let her help, not because he wanted to, because for the first time his body gave him no choice. They stumbled inside together. The door slammed behind them. Relative silence fell sharp and sudden compared to the howling outside. They stood in the hallway, both of them soaked through, breathing hard. Water dripped from their hair onto the polished oak floor. For 1 second, neither looked away. A crash from above shook the house. "The north wing," Cordelia called from somewhere. "Windows gone." They ran, together, through dark hallways as the lamps went out one by one. Wind screamed through the broken window, rain pouring in, soaking everything within reach. Lightning turned the world to stuttering blue-white. "Help me," Garrett shouted. Together they dragged heavy furniture, a wardrobe, a table blocking the gap, stuffed cloth into cracks. The storm fought them for every inch. Lightning split the sky. Darkness. "Come on!" Garrett found her hand in the black, his fingers wrapped around hers, firm and warm and certain. He led her through the hallway into his study. A match struck, light returned soft and golden and close. Outside, the storm raged. Inside, the world was different. Garrett poured whiskey, wrapped a blanket around Clara's shoulders. His hands lingered there a moment longer than necessary. She was still shaking, not just from the cold. Thunder cracked so hard the floor vibrated. Clara flinched. Without thinking, she stepped closer. Garrett did not step back. "My parents died during a storm like this," she whispered. Her voice was so quiet it nearly drowned in the wind outside. His arm came around her. Strong, certain, protective. A gesture so natural he did not have time to stop it. "I'm sorry," he murmured. She looked up at him. He was closer now, closer than he had ever been. The firelight from the single lamp painted his face in gold and shadow, and the hardness was gone. The iron was gone. What remained was the man beneath, raw and honest and afraid of what he was feeling. Garrett. His name left her lips like something sacred. He lifted his hand and placed it gently against her cheek. His palm was large, calloused, rough from years of rope and reins and hard weather. But he touched her as if she were made of morning light. "I tried to keep my distance," he said. His voice was rough, stripped down to bare wood. "Tried to do what was right." Her breath caught. "I can't anymore." The storm crashed around them. But it no longer mattered. Clara closed the last distance between them. Their lips met, and everything they had held back broke free at once. The kiss was none of the things she had imagined it might be. It was gentle, and it was certain, and it felt like finding the way home after being lost for years. Like the first warm day after a winter that lasted too long. When they finally pulled apart, the world had changed. Not dramatically, not with fireworks or declarations, with something quieter and more powerful, with the simple, enormous truth of two people choosing each other in the middle of a storm. "I don't care what they say," he whispered, his forehead resting against hers. "Neither do I," she answered. He held her close as the storm raged on outside the limestone walls. And for the first time in both their lives, neither of them felt alone. "I didn't expect you, but I'm not letting you go." Because some moments don't ask permission. They simply happen. And once they do, there is no going back. But the storm outside would pass by morning. The storm that was coming for the Callaway Ranch would not be so easy to survive. Because Silas Drummond was still out there. The hearing was still 3 weeks away. And Clara Whitfield was about to discover that the most powerful weapon to save everything Garrett had built was not a gun or a lawyer. It was a letter written by a poor minister 20 years ago on this very land in handwriting she knew as well as her own heartbeat. The storm broke sometime before dawn. Clara knew because the silence woke her. She was still in the study, still wrapped in the wool blanket Garrett had placed around her shoulders. The lamp had burned low, its flame barely a whisper of gold in the glass. Outside, the wind had stopped. The rain had stopped. The only sound was the slow drip of water from the eaves, steady and rhythmic, like a clock counting the first minutes of a world that had been rearranged. Garrett was asleep in the chair across from her, not relaxed. Even in sleep, his shoulders carried tension like a yoke. His head tilted back, jaw still hard, the stubble darker now. One hand rested on his knee. The other lay on the arm of the chair, open palm up, as if, even in unconsciousness, he had been reaching for something. Clara watched him for a long moment. She studied the lines around his eyes, the small scar on his chin. She had never noticed before the way his chest rose and fell with a slowness that suggested his body had finally surrendered to the exhaustion his mind refused to acknowledge. He looked younger when he slept, less iron, more human. She pulled the blanket tighter around herself and turned to the window. The sky was clearing from the east pale gold light, spreading over a landscape washed clean. Everything glistened. The yard, the fences, the distant mountains with their white peaks sharp against the brightening sky. The storm had scrubbed the world raw, and what remained was beautiful and fragile and new. Clara knew the feeling. She carried it inside her chest, right next to the place where Garrett's name had taken root. Morning brought damage assessment and clear skies. Part of the auxiliary stable roof had been torn away. The north window was shattered. The west fence line was down over a long stretch. But the cattle were safe. Harlan had moved them into the low valley before the storm hit, and his instinct had saved thousands of dollars and possibly the season. What had also changed quietly and without announcement was the space between Garrett and Clara. At breakfast, when they were both in the dining room for the first time since the previous evening, the air was different. Garrett pulled Clara's chair out before she sat down, a small gesture nearly unconscious. Cordelia saw it from the kitchen doorway and smiled into the skillet. Levi glanced between the two of them, and the first real smile he had worn in weeks crossed his face and disappeared. Boone saw it too. His reaction surprised everyone, including himself. He set down his coffee cup, looked at Garrett, and said simply, "About time, brother." Garrett did not respond, but the corner of his mouth moved just barely, and for the Calloway family that was equivalent to a parade. Winter always ends. But before happiness could set roots, the real fight began. 2 weeks before the hearing, Clara worked without stopping. She tore through every crate of old papers in the supply shed. She wrote to the Territorial Land Office in Helena. She consulted the only lawyer in Silver Bend, Old Morrison, who drank too much whiskey, but still remembered the law when it mattered. She cross-referenced dates, signatures, land descriptions, anything that might build the chain of ownership Garrett needed to defeat Drummond's forged document. And she kept studying her father's letter. By comparing the handwriting in the 1858 letter with the marginal notes in his Bible, Clara confirmed what her heart already knew. Reverend Josiah Whitfield had lived in Montana Territory in the late 1850s. He had purchased land along Bitterroot Creek, including water rights. He had been here on this very ground decades before Clara ever dreamed of coming west. But why did he leave? Where were the original ownership papers? What happened between 1858 and the day he returned to Massachusetts, married her mother, and never spoke of Montana again? Clara wrote a letter to the law office in St. Louis, whose address appeared on her father's old correspondence. She did not know if the firm still existed. She wrote it anyway, the way a woman throws a rope into dark water, hoping it catches on something solid. Meanwhile, she brought her discovery to Garrett. They sat in the study, the door closed. Clara laid the old letter on the desk between them. Garrett read it twice, his face unreadable. Then he looked up. "Your father owned this land before mine did." "Yes." "What does that mean? Do you have an inheritance claim?" Clara shook her head. "My father sold legally. I have no right to this land." She paused, then spoke more softly. "But if the original bill of sale still exists, it will prove that the water rights transferred with the land to your family. Not to Drummond. His forged papers would collapse." Garrett studied her for a long moment. "Why are you helping me? If your father was the original owner, you could challenge the whole sale." "On what basis? My father sold willingly. The transaction was lawful." She met his eyes. "But I have a reason to protect this place." Their gazes held. Nothing more needed to be said. "Built this with our own hands." Boone Calloway, true to form, wanted to solve the Drummond problem with his fists. "Let me ride over there and settle this," he said at the family meeting that night, leaning forward in his chair, energy coiled tight as a watch spring. Garrett shook his head. "We're not outlaws. We fight with the truth." Boone disagreed, but he respected Garrett enough to hold back. And then Clara's words from that quiet conversation on the back porch came back to him. "Maybe learn another weapon, besides fists." So Boone chose a different weapon. He went to investigate. No elegance, no subtlety. That was not Boone's way. He saddled Merchant Road 3 days to Butte and found the part of town where documents were manufactured for the right price. Every frontier town had such a place. He asked directly, Who forged land papers for Silas Drummond. Nobody talked. Boone sat in a saloon for 2 days, bought drinks for everyone, and listened. On the third day, a drunk man gave him a name. Boone found the forger, a small man with ink-stained fingers and nervous eyes, and gave him a choice. You can tell me the truth here sitting down drinking coffee, or you can tell the truth in court standing up under oath. The first option is considerably more pleasant. The forger looked at Boone, 6'3" shoulders like a barn door, hands flat on the table, amber eyes burning with a focus that left no room for negotiation. The man chose the first option. Boone rode back with 3 witness signatures and a written confession. He had not thrown a single punch, but his presence, the sheer physical reality of him, the unspoken promise of what the second option might look like, had been enough. When he handed the evidence to Garrett, the oldest brother looked at the papers, then at Boone. A long look. Then he nodded. Good work. Boone smiled, and for the first time the smile had nothing wild in it, only pride. A man keeps his word, and sometimes keeping his fists in his pockets is the hardest word to keep. Levi, meanwhile, did what nobody asked him to do. He rode to Helena, 3 days each way through mountain passes already threatening with early snow. He carried a detailed description of Garrett's symptoms, written by Clara, with the precision of a medical report listing frequency, duration, triggers, and severity. He delivered it to the best doctor in Helena and waited for an answer. The doctor's response came back cautious but hopeful. Based on the symptom description, the most likely diagnosis was chronic severe headache syndrome, possibly related to an old head injury. Had the patient ever been thrown from a horse, Garrett remembered a bad fall at 27, a kick to the head that left him dizzy for 3 days. The condition was painful and frightening, the doctor wrote, but not fatal. And there were treatments. He was willing to examine the patient in person. When Levi brought the news home, Garrett sat still for a full minute. Then he exhaled, a real breath. Deep and slow from somewhere, he had not allowed himself to reach in over a year. You'll go to Helena, Clara said. Not a suggestion. After the hearing, Boone and Levi will manage the ranch. I'll handle the books. Garrett looked at her, then at Boone, then at Levi. 3 faces, same bloodline, same message. You are not alone. All right, Garrett said, one word, but it carried the weight of a year of hidden fear being set down. Stronger together than apart. 1 week before the hearing, the letter from St. Louis arrived. The original lawyer had retired, but his son, also a lawyer, had searched the firm's archives. The envelope was thick. Old papers. Legal seals. Clara opened it with trembling hands. Inside was a history her father had never told her. Josiah Whitfield, a young minister with a dream of building a Christian community on the frontier, had arrived in Montana Territory in 1856. He purchased land along Bitterroot Creek, including full water rights, and began building a small chapel. For 2 years he lived there, working the land, preaching to scattered settlers, falling in love with the mountains, the way only a bookish man from the east can fall in love with wilderness. Then in 1858, his wife, who had followed him west with their infant daughter Clara, fell gravely ill. The nearest doctor was 200 miles away. Josiah, desperate, sold the land to Ezekiel Calloway, Garrett's father, to raise the money to take his wife back east for treatment. The bill of sale was in the envelope. Legal, certified, clearly stating that all water rights for Bitterroot Creek transferred with the land. Clara finished reading and sat motionless for 10 minutes. Her father had been here, had loved this land, had given up everything to save her mother, had gone back to Massachusetts and never returned because he could not bear to look at the place where he had lost his dream. And now his daughter, through a circle that no one planned, had come back to the exact spot where her father once stood. On the same land, beside the family of the man who bought it. This is where you belong. Always was. Clara wiped her eyes, gathered the papers, and went to find Garrett. This is the proof we need, Garrett said after reading it twice. The original bill of sale proves the water rights belong to Calloway Ranch. Drummond's forgery falls apart. Yes, silence. Your father sold this land to save your mother, Garrett said, and his voice had changed. Softer, rougher, both at once. My father believed people mattered more than land. Garrett looked at her for a long time. Then quietly, I think your father was right. From a man who had spent his entire life putting land above everything else, those words were a revolution, and only Clara could have caused it. The hearing took place on a Tuesday morning. The Silver Bend courthouse was a single room with pine walls, an American flag that needed ironing, a judge's bench built from local timber, and seating for about 40 people. More than 60 showed up. They stood along the walls, sat on windowsills pressed into the doorway. This was the biggest case Silver Bend had ever seen. Judge Coleman presided. 62 years old, Missouri-born, silver-haired, small-eyed but sharp, with a reputation for fairness so thorough that both sides were nervous. He had handled hundreds of land disputes across Montana territory and could smell a forged document from 10 feet away. Silas Drummond sat on the left in a black vest, hair slicked back, wearing the confident expression of a man who believed his money had bought the outcome. His Helena lawyer, young and city-polished, had a smooth voice and a stack of prepared arguments. On the right, the three Calloway brothers. Garrett in the center back, straight as a fence post, amber eyes fixed forward. Boone on his left foot, bouncing with restrained energy but face controlled. Levi on his right, quiet, watchful, scanning the room, the way he scanned open prairie for predators. Clara sat directly behind them, a manila envelope on her lap. Her hands were steady. Judge Coleman called the hearing to order. Drummond's lawyer stood and delivered his case, smooth words about historical rights and lawful transfer, and incontestable documentation. He presented the forged document with theatrical confidence. The judge took the paper, held it up to the window light, turned it over, examined the ink, the paper stock, the seal. His eyes narrowed. He set it down without comment. "Mr. Calloway, your response." Garrett stood. The room went silent. Iron Garrett, the man half of Montana respected and the other half feared, looked around the courthouse. Then, instead of speaking, he turned to Clara and nodded. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Clara rose, stepped forward, the smallest person in the room. Narrow shoulders, young voice. But when she began to speak, the room went so quiet you could hear the wind outside the windows. "Your Honor, my name is Clara Calloway, born Whitfield. I can prove that Mr. Drummond's document is a forgery because my father, Reverend Josiah Whitfield, was the original owner of the land where Calloway Ranch now stands." The murmurs erupted and died as the judge tapped his gavel. Clara presented the case with clarity that would have impressed a trained attorney. She laid out the history: her father's purchase of the land in 1856, including water rights; his sale to Ezekiel Calloway in 1858, fully documented and legally certified; the bill of sale explicitly stating that all water rights transferred with the land. She placed the original documents before the judge. He examined them with the thoroughness of a man who had seen every trick the frontier could produce. He checked the ink, the paper, the seal. He compared them silently to Drummond's document. Then Clara delivered the decisive point. "Mr. Drummond's document claims water rights were transferred in 1856. But my father purchased the land, including those water rights, also in 1856, and his purchase was registered at the Territorial Land Office 3 months before the date on Mr. Drummond's paper. Two legitimate documents for the same water rights cannot exist. One must be a forgery." Judge Coleman looked at Silas Drummond. "Mr. Drummond, explain." For the first time, Silas lost his composure. He looked at his lawyer. The lawyer stood stammering something about possible administrative errors. Boone rose to his feet. His voice was clear and hard, carrying the simple power of a man who does not waste words. "It's not an error. I have a signed confession from Arthur Finch, a document forger in Butte, confirming that Mr. Drummond hired him to fabricate the transfer document 2 months ago, along with 3 corroborating witness signatures." The courtroom erupted. Judge Coleman hammered his gavel 7 times before the noise subsided. He looked at Silas Drummond with the expression of a man who had seen too many liars in his years on the bench, and each one still disappointed him. "Mr. Drummond," the judge said, his voice heavy with authority, "I find your document to be a forgery. Water rights for Bitterroot Creek belong to Calloway Ranch based on the lawful chain of ownership from Whitfield to Calloway. You are charged with fraud upon this court. Deputy, take Mr. Drummond into custody." Silas stood face white, then red. He looked at Garrett with pure hatred. Garrett looked back without expression. Then Silas looked at Clara, and in his eyes was not just hatred, but astonishment. He had been defeated not by guns or money or power, but by a 21-year-old woman with her dead father's letter. The deputy let him out. The courtroom dissolved into noise and movement. Clara stood in the middle of it, all the empty envelope in her hands. She had done it. Not Garrett rescuing her. Not the three brothers protecting her. She, Clara Whitfield Calloway, orphan mail-order bride that nobody had ordered, uninvited housekeeper, who arrived with nothing but a worn valise, had saved the ranch. Garrett walked toward her through the crowd. People parted for him without being asked. He stopped in front of her, and the noise of 60 people faded to nothing. "Thank you," he said, low enough that only she could hear. "I told you, I have a reason to protect this place." And Garrett Calloway, in front of the entire town of Silver Bend, without hesitation, without looking around to see who was watching, reached down and took her hand. His large, warm, calloused hand wrapped around her small fingers and held on. Nobody missed it. Actions, not words. She had proven that better than anyone. That night, the three Calloway brothers sat together in the study for the first time in years. Not as boss and employees, as brothers. Garrett told the truth. All of it. The headaches, the vision loss, the fear. For the first time, he hid nothing. Levi, who had known, wept. Not loudly, just silent tears running down his cheeks as he sat with his head bowed, shoulders trembling. Boone, who had not known, clenched his fist so hard his knuckles went white. "Why didn't you tell us?" His voice shook, not from anger, but from something deeper than anger. "We're your brothers. You don't carry this alone." "I'm used to carrying things alone," Garrett said. "Then stop," Boone answered. Silence. Then Garrett nodded. Small, brief, but it was everything that needed to be said. Later that evening, Levi found Clara sitting by the fireplace in the main room mending a shirt. He sat down across from her without speaking, pulled a small piece of wood from his pocket, and began carving with the quiet focus that was his nature. They sat in comfortable silence for 10 minutes, the fire crackling, the knife whispering against wood. Then Levi spoke. "I want to apologize." Clara looked up. "For the advertisement. I brought you here without asking what you wanted, without thinking about who you were. I only thought about Garrett, about the ranch. I didn't think about the real person reading that ad in a cold room in Massachusetts." Clara set down her needle. "Levi." He looked up. His amber eyes, the warmest of the three brothers, glistened in the firelight. "If you hadn't placed that advertisement," Clara said gently, "I would still be in that cold room above the Pruitt store. My hands would still crack from lye soap. And I would still be afraid every time Vernon Pruitt stood too close." Levi swallowed hard. "You didn't take anything from me," she continued. "You gave me a chance, and that is the biggest gift anyone has ever given me. Except my father teaching me to read." Levi looked at her. Then slowly he held out the piece of wood he had been carving. It was not random. He had been working on it for weeks. It had a shape of a small house. The limestone ranch house miniaturized in the palm of a hand, roof porch, even a tiny horse figure standing by a fence. "For you," Levi said, voice low, "so you remember. This is home. Yours." Clara took the little wooden house, light, smooth, warm, from Levi's hands. She turned it over, studying the details. The tiny windows, the porch steps, the care in every cut. Her eyes filled. "Thank you, Levi." He nodded, brief and quiet, so much alike Garrett that Clara almost laughed. Then he stood, wished her good night, and left. Clara sat by the fire with the wooden house in her palm and understood with a certainty that went deeper than thought that the three Calloway brothers had each given her something different. Garrett gave her protection. Boone gave her laughter. Levi gave her home. You're home now, and this time home isn't a place, it's people. 1 week after the hearing, before Garrett left for Helena, Clara rose early. She went to the creek. This time she was not alone. Garrett appeared at the stable while she was saddling Goldie. He stood in the doorway, hat in hand, morning light behind him. "I know where you're going," he said, not a question. Clara looked at him. "Do you want to come?" He nodded. They rode side by side in the dawn light, neither speaking. The sound of hooves on wet grass, wind through the cottonwoods, birds calling the day awake. Enough, more than enough. At the creek, Clara stopped at the water's edge. The same pool where she had stood that first morning, where she had felt free for the only time in her life, where she had looked up and seen him watching from the ridge, and everything had changed. The water was the same, clear still, reflecting a sky that was turning from gray to gold. The cottonwood trees leaned over the pool as they always had, their leaves now fully gold and bronze, catching light like coins. "The first time I came here," Clara said, I wanted to wash everything away. I wanted to forget who I was. And now, Garrett asked, standing beside her close but not touching. Clara watched the water. Same creek, same stones, same trees, but she was different. Now I don't want to forget. I want to remember. All of it, even the parts that hurt, because it brought me here. Garrett looked at her, dawn light on her face. Small beside the creek in the middle of land that had once belonged to her father and now belonged to the man standing next to her. The circle was so complete it seemed designed by someone wiser than either of them. Stay, he said, not a command, a request rough with emotion he did not know how to handle. As a housekeeper, Clara asked, the ghost of a smile crossing her face. As my wife. The Montana wind moved through the valley. Water ran over stones. Somewhere above, a hawk called sharp and clear against the enormous sky. I don't have a dowry, Clara said, her eyes bright with tears she did not try to hide. No family, no name. You have something I can't buy with money, Garrett said, his voice cracking at the edges in a way that the entire territory would never have believed. You gave me a reason to stop just surviving and start actually living. Clara smiled, the real smile, the one he had first seen at this creek when she thought no one was watching, bright and free and full of everything she had been afraid to feel. Yes, she said, I'll stay. Garrett took her hand. They stood at the water's edge, the place where it all began, and watched the sunrise paint the Montana prairie in gold. No kiss. They did not need one. Two hands held together new light old water. It was more perfect than any kiss could have been. You're home now, and this time you know it. The wedding took place in late autumn in the small church in Silver Bend. Simple. The frontier way. Clara wore a white dress that Cordelia had sewn by hand. Not silk from San Francisco. Good cotton, the best the town could offer, cut with skill, tiny wildflower embroidery at the collar. Her mother's ivory comb held her honey gold hair. The cameo brooch at her throat. Garrett wore his only dark vest pressed flat by Clara that morning. For the first time anyone could remember, Iron Garrett stood in public without dust, without sweat, without the invisible armor he wore like a second skin. His amber eyes went bright when Clara walked through the church door, and though he would deny it until his last breath, two people in the front row saw the moisture there. Boone stood at Garrett's right. Best man. Straight back jaw set, but the corner of his mouth turned up in a way that was not wild or reckless, but simply quietly proud. This was his brother, and his brother was no longer alone. Levi stood at the left, tears running freely down his face, making no attempt to hide them. He had started everything with an advertisement in a newspaper. He had risked Garrett's fury, his own guilt, and the fate of a stranger. And now, watching his oldest brother hold the hand of the woman that advertisement had brought across 2,000 miles, Levi knew he had done right. Harlan Mercer sat in the first row, silver mustache trembling. Cordelia wept into a handkerchief through the entire ceremony. Why are you crying? Because I'm happy, you old fool. The minister read the vows. Garrett spoke his with the weight of mountains behind every word, slow, clear, each one landing like a stone placed deliberately in a wall built to last. I take you as my wife, in hardship and plenty, in storm and sunlight, on this land until the land takes me home. Clara spoke hers without trembling. For the first time in her life, her voice was steadier than it had ever been. I take you, not because I have nowhere else to go, but because everywhere else is nowhere without you. The town attended nearly every soul in Silver Bend, even people who had whispered, even people who had judged. Not because they had changed their minds, but because Clara had proved herself, not by bowing her head, by keeping it high. Vivian Prescott was not there. She and her father had left Silver Bend after the scandal of the hearing. Augustus Prescott's financial connections to Drummond had surfaced during the court proceedings, and he had sold the bank and moved to San Francisco. Vivian went with him. The town forgot her faster than April snow. A man keeps his word, and today he kept the last promise his mother ever gave him. Don't grow old alone. Winter came to Montana the way a hammer falls on iron, hard and without warning. Snow began in November and did not stop until March. Temperatures dropped below -20. Wind cut through the valley like a blade made of ice. The limestone house walls, a foot thick, became a fortress against the cold. Clara learned to survive a Montana winter. Cordelia taught her everything. How to keep the fireplace fed through the night, oak logs, not pine because pine burned fast, and oak burned slow and steady. How to make stew from dried beef and beans that would warm a man who had worked 8 hours in snow. How to wrap wool around the water pipes so they would not freeze and burst. Garrett taught her to shoot, not for romance, for survival. Wolves came down into the valley in winter when hunger drove them from the high country. Bears sometimes wandered close. A woman on the frontier needed to know how to protect herself, not through words, but through shared work, shared meals, long evenings by the fire, when snow piled against the windows and the world shrank to the size of a warm room.